you're building a curriculum, you definitely need to have some of the unique procedural processes, particularly pre-trial and post-trial. But what you can never forget is that being a trial attorney is a very unique skill set and particularly with organization, I see is where our guys lack. And so I always focused on, hey, what are the mechanics? How are you going to do this? How are you going to organize this? And then talk to me about theme and theory later. I want to know how you're going to actually work this case forward.
Make them build a proof matrix. If you can't show me a proof matrix that shows what evidence you'll offer on every element of the offense, and then show me your theory of admissibility for every one of those pieces of evidence, you're not ready.
That was just standard trial.
A lot to learn.
But our trial ad program was built by taking stuff from the civilian world, a lot of ABA journal stuff.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of that author's name. Yeah,
McNeil.
McElhaney. All his stuff. It was taking stuff from the civilian world, and the trial part itself was the same. One thing I was going to mention earlier about just the standing courts, it turns out that one of the most difficult things for prosecutors, which is something that you can't really teach, is because we don't have standing courts, the prosecutor is essentially in charge of making a courtroom occur whenever there's a trial, right? There's not a staff, there's not a professional judiciary corps that's running our courts. So we have lots of just kind of dopey errors that are built into cases just because of the inexperience of having to pull things. I mean, you got prosecutors running around filling up water pitchers and stuff like that.
You haven't lived until you've been yelled at in open court for not having coffee for the panel members.
Or the air conditioner not working.
Or the air conditioner not working.
Yeah, and then stuff, yes, all that stuff that should be pushed over to somebody else. And I think, and we just brought it up quickly, that what happened in the Military Justice Act when we broadened the judge's powers beyond any real source, right, beyond any power from a convening authority, that was the first crack in breaking down this just an antiquity, right? The fact that we convene a court presto out of nothing and then adjourn it at the end and it disappears. I think that's going away in probably the next 20 years. Where we'll actually have, even dopey things like the font on the top of an order. You can't put in the First Judicial Circuit of the there is no, First Judicial Circuit is a administrative, how do I rate my judges? There is no such thing as the First Judicial Circuit in the U.S. Army. It's United States versus accused. That's it. And so I think at some point it's going to be getting rid of our post-trial process, which now is pretty much gotten rid of, other than leaving enough behind to make it a headache. Just getting rid of the post-trial process, giving all that over to a professional judiciary class, or not a class, but a branch, and they pick all those duties up. And then for the trial counsel, it really is, you show up, you try your case, you try it the way McElhaney and I'm trying to think of the old Chicago public defender.
McCarthy?
Terrence McCarthy. Just doing it the way those guys do it. And it looks pretty much the same.
Ma'am, do you have a question?
Thank you all for being here. You did a great job for a complicated area for those that don't live in that world. I'm curious, I know you mentioned earlier, Professor Carpenter, that you are studying to see if any of this works. Within the military, there have been a lot of changes since the sexual assault types of surveys have changed. You've changed the processes. You've changed some of the charges. What is working and what is not? And I'm curious more in terms of even with giving special victims counsel extra standing within a courtroom. The accused has got constitutional rights. The government's got its interest. The victim does have some statutory rights, but they don't trump the others. Are they adding to more litigation out there? What do we know is defined? I'm waiting for a Brady challenge where a victim gives information to somebody in the government because you're paid by the government. Defense can't get it because it's confidential. I mean, so what is working and what's not? And what preliminary thoughts do you have if you're studying to say, okay, is any of it working?
So let's say hypothetically that I've got a FOIA request that's inside an Excel spreadsheet on this hypothetical computer, right? So what I'm measuring right now is whether the change in 2007 from a common law statute to what essentially is a Michigan model statute, an offender-centric statute, has had any effect. And I can measure at the law enforcement level, and I can also measure at the commander level, right? So what decisions did law enforcement make on a case? What decisions did the convening authority make on a case? And see if that 2007 change had any impact. My hypothesis is going to be that it doesn't, right? And that's because there are still normative places in the law where all the either rape myths or beliefs about how victims should behave, men should behave, how men and women should behave in sexual situations can still flow through the law. So I think it's gonna turn out that changing substantive law doesn't matter that much. Changing norms does matter, and I can also take just to see how have things changed overall, I've got it from 2004 on to now. Seeing if there are some changes, I think any causal factor behind those changes is gonna be much more about the normative work that's being done in terms of what does a sexual assault actually look like, the things that you all have learned as special victim counsel that have now gotten out into the field. And I can look for that trend analysis. One thing I have done is I have measured, I wanted to see if convening authorities were biased in particular cases, so I picked up a few years worth of data, looked at, do they send it to a court martial, do they send it to NJP, do they go administrative, or take no action? And it turned out that convening authorities, and I compared that with other serious crimes of violence against the person, and it turned out there wasn't any bias at that point, so commanders were treating these cases about the same or sometimes more seriously than murders, robberies, and other assaults. Now, it could turn out that that's because bias acted at the law enforcement stage, and I have been through that data, and there is bias at the law enforcement stage, so we still have a problem with, and this is still good news for those who want to keep the commanders in the system. I'm shifting blame from commanders to law enforcement. But law enforcement, military law enforcement, unfounds, it finds insufficient evidence in sexual assault cases at a much higher rate. You look at the average, like, ooh, that's not good. I still have to publish that finding. But there is a lot of work to be done, and part of it is just that there are so many changes that we don't have any kind of a pause to see if something is working. A lot of the changes, you don't need to wait for a pause, right? So everything that the people at this table are doing is super valuable, right? You don't have to wait to see if helping victims has an impact on things, because it's just the right thing to do. But I think in terms of messing around with the law, and what we're left with now really is, are the commanders going to stay in the system or not? That we should have just kind of a pause to see if other things are working before we start saying, well, we need to take commanders out because it's still broken. And I think it's not broken.
That's another lesson that, again, to the topic of the panel discussion here is what the civilian sector might learn from the military experience in this realm. You might get some help from Congress.
Yeah.
And initially that may seem unwelcome to you, but I'll use just a couple of examples that are procedural undertakings. I'm not sure how often Congress reaches into the federal rules of evidence, but a few years ago, Congress passed a law as part of an NDAA that changed Military Rule of Evidence 513. It changed the standard of confidentiality for psychotherapist patient privilege and changed the procedural rules by which an accused might seek to obtain those records to the extent, ma'am, as you pointed out, they might be relevant because they contain Brady material. Spoiler alert, you're not getting it. They're in the process of examining whether or not the rules with respect to character under 404A, MRE 404A, and our rules mirror the federal rules of evidence and numbering. And so there have been some very, very specific changes to what seemed like just minutiae in the rules. I think those procedural changes are having a significant effect on the pace of the litigation and its character too. And that may continue. I'll be interested to see Colonel Carpenter's work and where he's going with that. Like I said, it's an exciting time to be doing this.